Long before there was the Saturday Night Live crew with their parodies of politics and culture, there was Gilbert and Sullivan. One of my favorite lines from their operetta, The Mikado, explains what I think our research provides for our novels. The character Pooh Bah describes his unabashed lies like this: "They're merely corroborative detail intended to give artistic verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative." So our research gives depth to what would otherwise be a flat fictional world. If I want to visualize my characters and their environments, those environments have to be believable and relatable. So unless I'm writing fantasy or sci-fi, creating a realistic setting takes research. I'm going to leave the worlds of fantasy and sci-fi alone because both involve extensive and detailed world building, and that can be very difficult, too demanding for me at this stage of my life. For example, it took J.R.R. Tolkien 12 years to write The Lord of the Rings and another 5 years to perfect it, and that's not for me. At the same time, it doesn't mean that basing fictional settings in real places isn't challenging. I still had to go deeply into my research so that the story was solidly grounded in the facts, and the more detailed the research, the more artistic verisimilitude, to use Pooh Bah's words, the setting can lend to the story. I learned that lesson the hard way in my first novel, We Are Not Saints, The Priest. I noticed that my characters were unusually young to be vying for the position of bishop, but I thought, well, if anyone notices, they'll figure that the authorities made an exception for these guys. I should have known better. A reader noticed and criticized it in the second review that came out after it was published. Just as I love finding continuity errors in movies, readers love finding and pointing out inconsistencies like that. They may love finding them, but at the same time it spoils the story for them. They lose their suspension of disbelief. As a result, I had to revamp my whole timeline and issue a second edition. My lesson was never, ever to cut corners in research and accuracy of detail. I'd like to talk a little bit about the two sides of research: data gathering and information storage and retrieval. First, I'll cover some of the tools I used to collect the information I needed for my novels, and then I'll consider the ways I was able to keep and retrieve that hard-earned information. If you remember, in my last episode, I introduced you to several of my early characters. I told you about writing pages and pages of thoughts about them until I felt I knew them intimately. My next step was to locate them in the reality I was about to create, a reality that Einstein called space-time. That's the where and when of the story. It entails creating two story elements: the starting point on the timeline and the first setting. For the priest, I wanted my story to begin where the boys' ministry as priests began, at their ordination. So my first point in space-time was the seminary in Rome on the morning of their ordination. I'd been to Rome, but never to that seminary. Not so long ago, a good author would have packed up and gone to Rome to check it out, or would have lived there and experienced something like this. Today, it's a totally different story. I can do a deep dive without leaving my study. People take photos of everything. You want to see the inside of a restaurant? Just Google it. Want to see where a typical seminary is in Rome? Just Google it. And sure enough, students will have taken pictures of the insides. I was able to get detailed maps of the city, find streets, read restaurant menus, and examine apartments, condos, and houses for sale or rent, all from the comfort of my laptop. I like to say, despite the irony, Google is our friend. As I was collecting all this data, I soon realized that I shouldn't discard information about my chosen locales or settings, because often when I did, I had to go back later to retrieve it when the story took an unexpected twist and it became suddenly important. It's unavoidable. We amass many times more data than are ever used in the story. The next critical tool I used was Google Earth. Not only could I obtain aerial maps and photographs, but I could also, using Street View, walk the streets of places I've never been and drive remote highways in virtual reality. I've often been complimented by people from places I've never visited on how well I've captured the spirit of their city. Now, a brief note about AI, artificial intelligence. On one hand, artificial intelligence runs circles around the Google search engine to dig up information. If you're not using it for your research, you may be wasting precious time and energy. However, AI can be biased and come up with bogus information, so it pays to double-check all AI-supplied information. I've chosen never to let AI compose text for me. I do use Grammarly, an AI-based real-time grammar and spelling checker, to fine-tune my sentence structure, but I maintain my role as master with it as my servant. Let's switch gears over to the other dimension of our space-time research, our timeline. Once we've chosen a starting point in place and time for our story, that becomes our foundation. Are Not Saints is a series of 4 parallel books with characters crossing back and forth from one to the other. It would have been next to impossible to keep everyone at the right place at the right time without such a rigid schema. I'm very proud to say that in nearly 1,000 pages spread over the 4 books of the series, there's only one incident I'm aware of where one character is in 2 places at the same time in different books. But I challenge you to find that character and that incident. I also keep a set of calendars for each book, covering the period of the story. And using the date stamp on the chapters, I note their important incidents. I use it to go online to get the local weather on that date when it's useful. And there are several sites that provide full weather history for every locale and most dates, at least in the past 100 years. Once you've gathered your research by reading books, Googling, or visiting in real life, what do you do with it? How do you store that information? I told you in my second episode, Getting to Know You, that I learned about my characters by writing 3 or 4 single-spaced pages of notes on everything I could imagine about each one of them. You know, some writers used to compose at their typewriter and now they do it on their computers, while others still compose longhand. I fall into the latter category. I choose to write the old-fashioned way because it uses a different part of the brain. And even though I do enter the chapters and perform extensive edits at the keyboard, I still find nothing better than putting pen to paper to stimulate the flow of story ideas in a way that captures the imagination. I keep my research results in both electronic and hard copy. I found that for each book, a 2-prong file folder that holds 2 hole-punch pages on both sides works best for me. On one side, I keep my stack of calendars, as well as printouts of maps and photos and documents related to the story. On the other side, I keep handwritten notes, schemas, and diagrams of the story as it evolves, as well as designs of character family trees and my character notes. Even though everything is stored digitally, I find my manila folders invaluable while I'm writing. We're most fortunate to have so many powerful apps and online services available to us. Back in school, remember how difficult it was to find what you were looking for in your class notes? Here's how we can leverage the technology to help us find what we need when we need it in our data. I keep digital copies of all my useful research. A lot of material can be found and downloaded online. Others can be uploaded from our own files or scanned in. And there are dozens of apps and online sites that can help us organize all that material. One app that I find the handiest is Excel. There's a similar spreadsheet program from Apple. It's helpful in storing, arranging, and comparing facts, but even that has its limitations. For my series, I've used a Microsoft product called SharePoint, which is essentially Excel on steroids. It can mimic a relational database, but it's not for the digitally faint of heart. There's also a commercially available app called Scrivener, created especially for us authors. I've tried it and it's useful, but not quite as powerful as what I've needed. So that's a brief overview of my experience with doing research for fiction. And to sum up, I've spent way more time and energy doing research for my books than I did writing them. In the middle of writing a chapter, I've often had to switch off my author's hat and go back to my researchers. In my opinion, my stories were only as good as my research. Your experience may vary. What do you think? Feel free to leave your observations and personal experiences in the comments. Tell us what works for you and what doesn't. And just to whet your appetite, I'm working on a project right now to come up with a next level research, storage, and retrieval solution for us authors. Stay with me to find out what I'm doing. Now I'm taking the holidays off, but I'll be back with my next episode in a couple of weeks. Have a wonderful holiday and a happy new year, and I'll see you then.